Thank you all for coming out on such a nasty day to hear this. Uh, it's nice to be back in Carlisle. I miss hotchie dogs and frozen custard at Massey's and breakfast over at Faye's. So it's nice to be back in town. And I think after this, I'm going to head next door to the Hamilton and grab a hotchie dog. And I spent a lot of time in this place when I was working on this book, which began its life as a master's thesis. I was a regular here, and so almost every weekend they would find me here in the library doing research on this. So the strange case of Dr. Paul Schoeppe. And I was told, by the way, a friend of mine who is Austrian told me that it is pronounced Schoeppe, but she said, now Mark, he was Prussian. And she said the Prussians tend to be much more guttural in their pronunciations. So I'm using the Austrian pronunciation that she told me. She said it probably would have been much more guttural. But the background on this, Maria Stenik, a wealthy spinster, died in Carlisle on January 28, 1869. At first, her death was not considered to be suspicious. She had been suffering from palsy and she was under the care of a local physician, Dr. Paul Schoeppe, who had been visiting her on a regular basis. Following her death, her body was taken to Baltimore for burial. Questions were raised when, on the day following her death, Dr. Schoeppe presented a check at a local bank purporting to be drawn by Miss Stenig in his favor, but which smacked very strongly of forgery. In addition, after the probate of the decedent's will, Dr. Schoeppe presented a second will under which all of Miss Stenig's worldly possessions were left to him. Kind of suspicious. On February 10th, 1869, 13 days after Miss Stenig's death, her body was exhumed and an autopsy was performed in Baltimore. The autopsy revealed traces of prussic acid in Miss Stenig's stomach, indicating that she may have been poisoned. And on February 16th, 1869, Dr. Schoeppe was arrested and charged with her murder. So thus begins the case of Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Paul Schoeppe, which would focus nationwide attention and even international attention on the central Pennsylvania borough of Carlisle. Dr. Schoeppe is going to come within days of dying on Carlisle's gallows before the efforts of America's physicians and the German-American community combined to force a second trial that would ultimately free him. First, some background. Bouvier's Law Dictionary. Being a librarian, I always have to start off with a dictionary definition. Bouvier's Law Dictionary defines murder as the willful killing of any subject whatever with malice aforethought. Now, historically, poisoning has been regarded as a particularly heinous form of murder. All recognize this man, Henry VIII. Under Henry VIII, poisoning was declared to be high treason, and those found guilty were sentenced to death by boiling. I don't know if they add in carrots and noodles and made soup or not. In 1614, Sir John Croke, who was judge of the King's Bench, told a jury that of all murders, poisoning is ye worst and most horrible. 1, because it is secret. 2, because it is not to be prevented. 3, because it is most against nature and therefore most heinous. And 4, it is also a cowardly thing. Now, the laws adopted in Pennsylvania by Penn's proprietary government, that was in 1683, retained the punishment of death for murder. Now, the statute does not specifically mention the crime of poisoning, but certainly the crime of murder is still in force in Penn's colony. People are being put to death for that. Evidence becomes particularly relevant in a murder case involving poison. Why? Well, there's no smoking gun. There's no bloody knife. All you have is a body that you suspect may have a person that may have died from poisoning. Um, but you still have to prove the defendant guilty of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. So to prove a case of murder by poisoning, it's usually necessary to show three elements. First of all, that poison was in fact the cause of death. If it's not, well, you don't have a case. Second, you have to show that the accused administered the poison. And that's very often in these cases shown by circumstantial evidence. And third, it must be shown that the accused administered the poison with knowledge of its probable effects. If someone just happened to take what they thought was sugar, but it was rat poison, and put it in someone's tea, well, they may be guilty of manslaughter, but they don't have that malicious aforethought to be guilty of murder. As you might suspect, there's a great deal of emphasis on the testimony of physicians and medical experts in poisoning cases. Now, the public view of physicians was very mixed during this period. And you'll notice that Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who was a physician, said that, oh, well, people generally like doctors because they can swear in front of them, and they can't very well swear in front of a minister. But that was not necessarily the overall view. During the Civil War, there were soldiers on the battlefield who suffered wounds and did not go to the hospital because the last thing they wanted was a Civil War doctor operating on them. So the view of physicians is mixed. One other thing that comes out in this case, during this time period, there is no automatic right to appeal in capital cases. Today, we assume that that's a given. You've been convicted of murder, you get an appeal. Well, not at this time. Some background. You all recognize our Cumberland County Courthouse. Cumberland County is erected out of Lancaster County in 1750. It was Pennsylvania's sixth county, was the second county to be established on the western bank of the Susquehanna River. York beat us. By the way, we were formed out of Lancaster County. Lancaster kept the river. If a person is assaulted over at the Harrisburg Seaplane Base and they fall on the dock, it's a matter for the West Shore Police. They fall in the river, it's a responsibility of the Harrisburg Police. Because remember, Dauphin County's later formed out of Lancaster County. They got Lancaster's claim to the river. 48 counties or parts of counties have been formed out of what was once Cumberland County. Named after Cumberland County, England. The courts originally met at Shippensburg. You've probably been to Widow Piper's Tavern, or been past Widow Piper's Tavern down in Shippensburg. That's where the courts originally met. Carlisle was formed to serve as the county seat. In 1870, Carlisle has a population of 6,630 residents, according to the census. And we have 1,288 dwellings in the borough. The overall county population at that time is 43,898. And our Cumberland County Courthouse, built in 1846, first shelved during the Gettysburg campaign. Even though that is the Cumberland County Courthouse, at this time, the judicial district extends beyond Cumberland County. We also include Perry County and Juniata County in this judicial district. Today, of course, we have a judicial district that corresponds with our county borders. That was not the case at this time. We also have the Cumberland County Jail, built in 1854, serves as county office space today. Dr. Schoeppe was imprisoned here from 1869 until 1872. So he spent a good chunk of his life here. Some of the people that are involved in this case: the Honorable James H. Graham presided at the first trial of Dr. Schoeppe. Judge Graham was born in West Pennsboro Township in 1807. He was elected to the bench in 1851, re-elected in 1861. By the way, Judge Graham had earlier presided over another murder trial here in Cumberland County. In 1863, Corporal John Barney was killed here in Carlisle, and a number of men were arrested and charged with his murder. And as the trial progressed, they realized that they had a very weak case against one of the men. His name was Charles Falk. And so they dropped the charges against him and called him as a witness. And he took the stand and he looked up at Judge Graham and said, "Judge, can I be tried again for this murder?" And Judge Graham said, "No, Mr. Falk, as far as any earthly entity, you cannot be tried." And he said that you have just acquitted the wrong person. I committed the murder. And he proceeded to tell how he had murdered Corporal Barney. Another judge who's going to preside over Dr. Schoeppe's second trial is Benjamin F. Junkin. He defeats Graham in the 1871 election, replaces him on the bench. Junkin is not a Cumberland County lawyer. He's from Perry County. And he was a leading lawyer in that county. Perry County was very thrilled to have their first Perry County resident elected to the court. Two other attorneys that I will mention, I unfortunately don't have slides of them to put up. The district attorney in the first Schoeppe trial is Charles E. McLaughlin. He was born in 1838, graduated from Dickinson College in 1857. McLaughlin was no longer district attorney at the time of the second Schoeppe trial, but he assisted Wilbur Sadler had become the district attorney by that point, and McLaughlin assisted Sadler during that trial. And the other attorney that I'll mention, Dr. Schoeppe's lead attorney, was William H. Miller. Miller had studied law under Judge Reed's law school, which continues to exist today as the Penn State Dickinson School of Law, and he was admitted to the bar in August 1842. He preceded McLaughlin as a district attorney. So this Mr. Miller had experience on both sides, both the prosecutor and defense attorney. And he was actually assisted by a number of other lawyers, including the former Cumberland County President Judge Samuel Hepburn Sr. Dr. Schoeppe was a recent arrival in the borough of Carlisle. He moved here in July 1868, and he lived on Comfort Street. He spoke English, but with a decidedly German accent. Dr. Schoeppe was 5 feet 10 inches in height. It was said that he had a well-developed muscular frame, and that he was a rather handsome and noticeable person. He had a dark mustache, he wore gold spectacles, and he claimed that he had been born near Hanover in 1842. Now, when I say Hanover, I'm not talking about the place up the road where they make potato chips. I'm talking about Hanover, Germany. I do not have a photo of the decedent, Maria Stenek, but we know that she was born in Carlisle in 1799 and raised in Baltimore. A wealthy spinster, she had visited Carlisle in August 1868, and not feeling well, she consulted Dr. Schoeppe, who was the nearest doctor. And it was written in the newspapers that from this professional visit, their acquaintance began and continued from that time until her departure to Baltimore sometime in October. And it was claimed that over time, Dr. Schoeppe's relationship with Miss Stenek changed from those of a medical attendant to those of a lover. Stenik dies in Carlisle on January 28th, 1869. Now, she had inherited from her father a sizable estate valued at between $40,000 and $50,000, which in 1869 is a lot of money. The day after her death, her will was found. It was dated November 17th, 1868. There are provisions for a number of various charitable donations in the will, including bequests to Princeton College, to Washington and Jefferson College out in Little Washington, PA, and to the American Bible Society. The will was admitted to probate in Baltimore's Orphan Court on February 1st, 1869. And immediately thereafter, Dr. Schoeppe's attorney presented to the court a subsequently written will, attested to by Schoeppe and Schoeppe's father. And under this will, Dr. Schoeppe inherited her entire estate, and he was appointed sole executor. Oh, by the way, the will that he presented, it was in his handwriting. Is anyone seeing some suspicious action here? Now, the Carlisle Herald at the time wrote that there are now serious surmises as to how the latter will to a foreigner and comparative stranger was obtained. This also connects itself with the sudden death. Means are being taken to sift the whole matter and, if possible, unravel its apparent mystery. So on February 10th, 1869, 13 days after her death, Miss Stenik's body was exhumed and an autopsy was performed in Baltimore by Dr. William K. Aiken. Aiken was professor of chemistry at the University of Maryland. The autopsy revealed traces of prussic acid in her stomach, indicating that she may have been poisoned. On February 16th, 1869, Dr. Schoeppe was arrested and charged with her murder. The matter now splits into two separate cases. In Baltimore, we have a civil trial involving her will. In Carlisle, we have a criminal trial for her murder. The civil case is largely suspended, pending the outcome of the criminal case up here in Carlisle. There is a preliminary hearing for Dr. Schoeppe. We learned during that hearing that Ms. Stenik had arrived at the Mansion House on January 19th, 1869. The Mansion House, of course, a Carlisle Hotel, just up the street here. We know that she did not become seriously ill until the day before her death. And Dr. Schoeppe came to the hotel to see her 3 times that day. The next morning, she was found to be insensible and speechless. The hotel owner, who was Mr. Burkholder, sent for Dr. Schoeppe and another Carlisle doctor, Dr. A.J. Herman. They arrived approximately 9:30 that morning. Now, odor could be seen to be a sign of the use of various poisons, and prussic acid has the aroma of bitter almonds. None of the witnesses who testified at the preliminary hearing sensed any unusual odors. In fact, they were specifically asked, did you smell anything that smelled like bitter almonds? No. Dr. Herman, who was there, smelled nothing. By the way, Dr. Herman, when he arrived, he said he did not even attempt to treat Miss Stenik because he said he saw death in her. So following this preliminary hearing, bail is denied to Dr. Schoeppe, so he's going to remain in the Cumberland County Jail until 1872. The actual trial of Dr. Schoeppe begins on May 24th, 1869. Testimony shows that the doctors who performed the autopsy, they looked at Miss Stenik's stomach, they poked around her brain, they did not look at her kidneys. Big mistake. They had the Commonwealth called a Harrisburg druggist who came in and said, well, yes, I did sell prussic acid to a German doctor, but he could not identify Dr. Schoeppe is the doctor who bought the prussic acid. In fact, one physician who testifies for the Commonwealth, Dr. Kiefer, said that as a result of what he saw, he could not unconditionally say that prussic acid caused Miss Stenick's death. In fact, one thing that he points out is that if you spit in a glass and let it sit overnight, the next morning you will find traces, minute traces of prussic acid in that glass. Dr. S.D. Caudry, who is the assistant surgeon of the United States Army, offers testimony for the defendant, and he underscores the importance of the failure to perform an actual examination of Miss Stenick's kidneys. And he offered several examples where an examination of the kidneys was necessary to show the cause of death. But the most significant testimony offered by the defendant is from Dr. Charles Francis Himes. Dr. Himes is the professor of natural sciences at Dickinson College, and he directly countered the testimony offered by Dr. Aiken. He explained the various fallacies connected with the tests that Aiken had performed. And he noted that even if the tests were properly done, they were still inconclusive in the absence of any confirming test. Another doctor who testified for Dr. Schoeppe was Dr. T.G. Wormley of Starling Medical College and Capital University. And he said that, yes, prussic acid will kill you very quickly, usually within 15 or 20 minutes after ingesting it. Remember, Miss Stenick became sick the day before and survived into the next day. On June 3rd, following closing arguments, Judge Graham delivers a charge to the jury. He says, you can either find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree, of murder in the second degree, of voluntary manslaughter, or you could find that he is not guilty of any crime. The jury retires at 1 p.m. and 4 hours later, it returns with a finding of guilty of murder in the first degree. And what we later learn is that when the jury is deliberating, a crowd gathers outside the courthouse and they start shouting, "Hang the damn Dutchman." So, Dr. Schoeppe is sentenced to be hanged by the neck until you are dead. And just as Judge Graham concludes that sentence with the words, "And may God have mercy on your soul," William Gould, who is Cumberland County's 73-year-old court crier, clutches his chest, falls forward, and he's dead. He falls into the arms of some of the people around him. And we have a courtroom with a lot of doctors in it, but he was dead. By the way, the courthouse is said to be haunted. So maybe Mr. Gould's ghost is one of the ones there. So on September 4th, Dr. Schoeppe's attorneys applied to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court for a writ of error. Alec Cotter is denied by the court. Essentially, the court says, no, we don't see anything wrong with the decision here. We're not going to hear this case. There, matters might have ended. We might have had a small town doctor dying at the end of a rope on Carlisle's gallows. But it doesn't come to that, because people come to Dr. Schoeppe's aid. He has a number of allies who work on his behalf. The medical profession. Doctors around the country write letters to the governor urging that Schoeppe be retried. They probably saw themselves also dangling at the end of a rope for a bad medical decision. The German American community, which is very powerful politically at this time, comes to Schoeppe's defense. And finally, major newspapers, particularly the Philadelphia newspapers, to a lesser extent the New York newspapers, come to Schoeppe's defense. Now there's one paper that stands strongly in the hang him category, and that is the Baltimore Sun. Why? Well, Miss Stenick was from Baltimore. And so the Baltimore paper is saying, go ahead, hang him. Now, the German American groups and the medical associations send numerous letters and petitions to the governor. That was John W. Geary. Geary was a Civil War hero, and he had been elected governor, began serving in 1866. And he's at the time of that this is all going on, he's in his second term. On November 10th, 1869, Dr. Schoeppe's attorney, Mr. Miller, along with Dr. Himes from Dickinson College and a number of other medical experts, appear before Governor Geary and before the Commonwealth's Attorney General, who at that time is F. Carroll Brewster, and they argue that Schoeppe be pardoned. Following the arguments, the Attorney General recommends that the governor decline to review the case. And so instead, the governor signs a death warrant for Dr. Schoeppe. He actually signs 2 Cumberland County death warrants. The other one that he signs is for Adam Titus. Titus had admitted his guilt in the murder of a friend. And so there really was not a whole lot of controversy there. So we have 2 death warrants signed. And the December 22nd, 1869 is set as the date of execution. The case had attracted international attention. This case is reported on page 1 of the London Times. So articles appear throughout other European newspapers as well. In early December 1869, the Prussian minister to the United States, Baron von Gerholt, came to Harrisburg to discuss the case with the governor. He did that at the urging of German American groups. As a result of this, along with continued correspondence from Pennsylvania Germans, from doctors, continued press coverage, the governor apparently has a change of heart. On December 11th, 1869, the Attorney General announces that he would issue a writ of error in the case, and Governor Geary immediately withdrew Dr. Schoeppe's death warrant. A bill is introduced in our General Assembly. It's called an Act to Allow Writs of Error in All Cases of Murder and Voluntary Manslaughter. It passes the General Assembly on February 4th, 1870. That would have given people convicted of murder that automatic appeal up to the Supreme Court. The governor vetoed the bill. His veto was overridden by the legislature on February 15th, 1870. Good news for Dr. Schoeppe, right? No. Why? The state Supreme Court had heard Schoeppe's writ of error on February 14th, one day before the legislature passes this law. And so their Valentine gift to Dr. Schoeppe is to say, no, we don't have to hear this. But Schoeppe was to receive assistance from another source, because Cumberland County is about to get a new judge. As I said before, the 9th Judicial District then includes Cumberland, Perry, and Juniata counties. And the Republican Party chooses a very popular lawyer from Perry County as its candidate. It was later written that Judge Graham lost the case because of his handling of the Schoeppe case. From what I found in the newspapers, that is not the case. The main factor seems to be Judge Graham's age. Graham is then 71. And a 10-year term, people are saying, no, we don't want an 81-year-old judge. So Junkin winds up winning the election. By the way, it's a very close election. Don't ever let anyone tell you that one vote does not make a difference. Jenkins lost Cumberland County by 8 votes. And Judge Graham actually got a majority of the votes in Juniata County. But Jenkins did very well in Perry County. And he won the election by 10 votes. 10 votes. On February 8th, we have a new bill introduced in the State House. It's called Senate Bill 601, introduced by Senator J.M. Weakley of Cumberland County. And it authorizes the Court of Oyer and Terminer of Cumberland County to open the judgment in the case of the Commonwealth against Paul Schoeppe and to grant a new trial if said court shall think proper. The bill is signed into law by Governor Geary on March 28, 1872. Well, no surprise, Judge Junkin immediately orders the second trial for Dr. Schoeppe. The trial commences with jury selection on Wednesday, August 28th. Representing the Commonwealth is our new district attorney, Wilbur Sadler. He was assisted by the former district attorney, Mr. McLaughlin, and Schoeppe retains his defense team. The murder trial of Dr. Paul Schoeppe finally comes to an end on the morning of September 7th, 1872. We have a very large crowd in the courtroom to hear the verdict. Judge Junkin sends the jury off. He informs them that the administration of prussic acid was very improbable. He ruled out theories of poisoning as altogether unsustained by the testimony, and the jurors were told that it was their duty to acquit the defendant. We call that a directed verdict. Okay, jury, you can go back in the jury room, play pinochle, play cards, do whatever you want. Just come back with the verdict as I am telling you to rule. The jury returns 15 minutes later with a verdict of not guilty. They were discharged with the thanks of the court, and Dr. Schoeppe is now a free man. Now, Schoeppe's career in Prussia had earlier been questioned. Remember, I told you we have 2 cases going on here. We still have that civil case down in Baltimore involving the will. Well, the court down there had asked George Bancroft, who was the United States minister to Prussia, to do some research on Schoeppe's background. And Bancroft discovered that Schoeppe had studied theology at the University of Berlin, but he did not have a medical degree. Herr Schoeppe is not a doctor. Whoopsie. Now, Mr. Bancroft also learned that in 1861, Schoeppe had stolen money from his employer, who was a Prussian count, and he had forged the count's signature. He had also, by the way, forged an invitation to an 1862 royal ball. In fact, he ennobled himself in that forgery. He gave his name as Paul von Schoeppe. So he was arrested, charged with forgery, theft, and extortion. He had been found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison, and he was ordered to pay a large fine. He began serving his sentence in Prussia in 1862. He was released on June 24th, 1868, and he was provided with traveling directions for America. Okay, Herr Schoeppe, yes, please get out of Prussia. Now, following his acquittal in Carlisle, Schoeppe briefly took to the lecture circuit. But his career on the lecture circuit did not last long, probably because word came out that this guy was a criminal. Not necessarily a murderer, but a criminal. So he instead moved west. In 1874, he was arrested in Illinois and charged with swindling the German Relief and Aid Society and passing forged checks under the name of Count Schulenberg. And by the way, when the case is called, Herr Schoeppe made a major mistake. None of you ever make this mistake. He paid his lawyer with a forged check. The lawyer promptly tossed the case. So Schoeppe was convicted of forgery and sentenced to 3 years here in the Illinois State Penitentiary. Because he was confined, Herr Schoeppe was not present when the suit for the estate of Miss Stenick's will was called for trial in the Orphans Court in Baltimore. Not surprisingly, his petition did not prevail. He's a convicted forger. Why would they pay any attention to a will in his handwriting? So Miss Stenick's will of November 17th, 1868 was instead accepted for probate. By the way, I was in touch with the archivist at Washington and Jefferson College, and she said, oh, for many years, they had a Stenick scholarship that was funded through the money that she had left to the college. So, New York. In May of 1880, Alfred Gelman, who was a tanner and a lumber dealer in Port Jarvis, New York, applied for a warrant for the arrest of a man named John P.G. Smith. Smith had been a bookkeeper for Gelman, but he had left his employment in August 1876 to study law at Columbia Law School. And Gelman claimed that while he was attending law school, Smith had supported himself by forging checks in Gelman's name. Found guilty, Smith was sentenced to 5 years in Sing Sing. There he was identified as being none other than Paul Schoeppe. So he serves his time there. After his release from Sing Sing, Paul Schoeppe is last mentioned in the New York newspapers in 1872. And he thereafter appears to be lost to history. I talked back and forth with the late Dr. Whitfield Bell, who had been the Boydley Sparr Professor of American History here at Dickinson College and librarian and executive officer of the American Philosophical Society. And he told me that he learned that Schoeppe had died in Texas about 1913. And I can still hear Dr. Bell saying, oh, I wish I could figure out where I put the notes from this, because I can't find anything in the census records that confirm this. But remember, Schoeppe has already operated under the name Smith. He's already operated under the name Schulenberg. So he was undoubtedly using another name when he was in Texas. Certainly an alias was not beyond him. The Chicago newspaper, the Daily Inter-Ocean, had actually earlier predicted that Schoeppe would adopt a new name and head for the far west where he would plan some new crimes. So what comes out of this trial? Well, first of all, the Schoeppe law. Remember that law that was adopted one day too late to help Dr. Schoeppe? But it takes effect. And thereafter, anyone convicted of a murder or manslaughter gets an automatic appeal to the state Supreme Court. Remember, we don't have a superior court at this time. Appeals go from the trial courts up to the Supreme Court. That is actually inserted into the Pennsylvania Constitution when we adopted a new Constitution in 1873. Second, a series of scholarly books and articles appear on topics dealt with in the trial, including expert testimony, including poisoning. So many of the questions that existed when this case went to trial are answered for later trials. Third, the German-American community is united. Now, can I say that the Pennsylvania German Society is founded a few years after the Schoeppe case because of this? No, I cannot say that, but it was founded shortly thereafter, and it seems that this case had brought the German-American community together. So it's certainly very possible. Finally, the AMA, the American Medical Association, adopts a new code of medical ethics One that says that, hey, you have to have limited actions with your patients. Yes, you can go perform house calls, but you cannot go beyond that, as Dr. Schoeppe had. So the Baltimore Sun calls Herr Schoeppe one of the great criminals of the age. They described him as essentially being false and hollow and a dangerous man to society. The Hagerstown Oddfellow called him an old reprobate. Did he get away with murder? We will never know. But we do know that in our judicial system, a juror must have no reasonable doubt of guilt. And reasonable doubts could certainly have existed in the minds of the Schoeppe jury. The Commonwealth failed to prove its case.
Round of applause for the secretary.